A city that prayed itself to death. A bell tower that never went silent. And a siege that ended in something worse than conquest. The wind off the Aegean was thick with ash. Not smoke, ash, fine as sifted bone, carried on the breeze like a warning too late to heed. Thessaloniki, once the jewel of Macedonia, had stood silent for days. No horns. No cries. No last speeches from ramparts. Just a stillness so absolute that even the gulls had vanished. Then, in the pale hours before dawn on the 29th of March, the eastern wall split with a sound like thunder muffled by cloth. A breach not born of fire or iron, but of fatigue. 7 years of hunger, plague, and unanswered prayers had hollowed the city from within. The Ottomans barely needed to fight. They walked through crumbling gates into a city already emptied of resistance, a husk. And yet, the moment they entered, the bells began to ring. It started with one. A low, solitary note from the dome of St. George. Then another, sharper, from the monastery of Latades. Then more, rising like a wave. Not chaotic. Rhythmic. Intentional. Dozens of church bells across the city chimed in eerie synchrony, echoing off marble colonnades and through corpse-still streets. No one could explain how. No ropes were visible in motion. No silhouettes in belfries. No hands at all. And yet the bells sang. Each toll landing heavy on the ear, as if counting not time, but souls. The Janissaries hesitated. Hardened men, veterans of Varna and Kosovo, suddenly wary. They advanced street by street with blades drawn and torches high, expecting ambushes behind every colonnade. Instead, they found icons overturned, bread crusts left on stone tables, and doors barred from the inside. The city was abandoned, not in truth, but in will. Life had withdrawn into the stones. Inside the church of the Archaeological, the air was thick with myrrh and smoke. Candles still flickered, dozens of them, their wax pooling like tears beneath the icons. A soldier touched the altar and drew back. It was warm. A priest's robes lay folded at its base, dusted with salt and ash. No body. Just absence. As if the faithful had simply stepped out, or evaporated. Near the rotunda, a lieutenant forced open the side chapel. The door groaned like a dying man, and inside they found pews stacked to the rafters, as if someone had tried to build a wall of worship. Beneath them, bones. Hundreds, tangled and white. Not buried. Arranged. Kneeling. Some with fingers still clenched in prayer. Others wrapped in decaying vestments, heads bowed, jaws open as if mid-hymn. But none of them had moved in years. That much was clear. And still the bells rang. In the citadel, the commander of the Ottoman vanguard climbed the bell tower of the prophet Elijah himself. The staircase spiraled in darkness. Dust clung to every step like skin. At the top, he found the rope swinging. Gently. As if recently touched. But the floor was bare. No footprints. No blood. Just a single human hand, severed at the wrist, resting in the center of the stone, fingers curled as if still holding something. Still warm. He did not scream. But when he descended, he did not give orders. He said nothing. Only touched his brow, as if saluting something unseen. By noon, the city had been taken. The banners of the crescent hung from ramparts, and cannon smoke drifted toward the sea. But inside Thessaloniki, the bells did not stop. They rang through the day, through the night, long after the last sword had been sheathed. And when the muezzin came to call prayer from the highest minaret, he paused at the threshold, looked west toward the cathedral dome, and stepped back. The air was humming. The chains were moving. And from within the empty churches came not silence, but breath. They moved through Thessaloniki as if through a plague-struck tomb. Dust clung to every surface, stirred only by the rustle of robes and the soft crunch of boots against marble mosaic. Banners hung limp, untouched by wind, and doorways stood sealed with ropes blackened by soot. The food they found was warm but tasteless, as though it had never been meant to be eaten. Bowls of lentils, half-chewed bread, wine undrunk. No shattered crockery. No signs of struggle. Just absence, clinical, absolute. In the outer quarters, the soldiers moved with care. There had been rumors, always. That Thessaloniki held strange rites in its shadows. That its monks kept relics not touched since the time of Justinian. That the city had once been promised to the Archangel Michael, and that the promise had never been rescinded. The Venetians had laughed. The Ottomans had not. Now, with conquest in their hands and no one left to fight, the air grew heavier by the hour. The churches should have been looted first. That was the tradition. Gold behind icons, chalices behind altars. But the men hesitated. Each basilica stood with doors shut but unlocked, as if inviting entry, or daring it. In the church of the Achairopoidos, the first to fall, the marble floor was covered in petals. Not fresh. Dried, almost fossilized, but arranged in a spiral toward the apse. A spiral wide enough for only one man to walk without stepping outside its line. The commander spat, stepped across it, and broke his ankle on nothing. He swore it had felt like a grip. Elsewhere, soldiers reported voices. Low, male, chanting in Greek or Latin, no one could say. But when they broke down the doors, they found the naves empty. Candles burned, but left no heat. Shadows flickered where there were no men. The bells continued to toll, irregular now, faster in some towers, slower in others. Not a call to prayer. A pattern. And still, no one living. In the bathhouses, steam still rose from copper pipes. In the dye shops, vats of indigo rippled with some unseen motion. In the governor's palace, the cushions bore the shape of bodies long since gone. It was not abandonment. It was subtraction. As if the people had been lifted away mid-breath, mid-step, mid-thought, erased, not fled. The central square, once a place of markets and executions, now held only two structures of note, the Basilica of Saint Sophia and, beside it, the half-completed minaret. A column of white stone, thin and cruel, stabbing the sky with unfinished intent. It had been raised by Ottoman engineers a month before the final breach, a symbol of what was to come. But now it stood mute. The muezzin had not climbed it. No prayers had been sung. And those ordered to ascend found their hands shaking before they reached the third step. One swore he heard whispering from inside the stone. Another vomited blood. Something had nested in the city, something not Ottoman and not Roman. Not new, but remembered, as one remembers a nightmare. In the afternoon light, the bells took on a new tone, deeper, slower. Not ringing, but groaning. As if the metal itself strained to speak. A captain named Halil placed his ear to a church door and recoiled, claiming to have heard the sound of breathing, long, drawn-out exhalations, echoing as if from a lung the size of a cathedral. Another officer laughed, kicked the same door, and screamed. A splinter of wood, no larger than a finger, had embedded itself in his eye. No one saw it fly. They began to call it the hollowing. A word whispered among soldiers too afraid to admit they were afraid. They slept in groups now, backs to walls, blades unsheathed. But no one had yet been attacked. No ambush. No arrows from rooftops. No boiling oil from windows. Just the bells. And the feeling that the city was not empty, but watching. At sunset, a red light bathed the stones. The towers cast long, unnatural shadows, curling at the edges like smoke. The air turned sour, not rot, not fire, but something metallic and sweet, like blood left too long in a chalice. From the highest bell tower near the northern gate, a single note held for almost 2 minutes, longer than any man could pull a rope. By the time it ended, 5 men had collapsed in the square, clutching their ears. They survived. But when questioned, each repeated the same phrase in perfect Greek, "He is almost awake." They did not know what it meant. But that night, no fire was lit in any tower. No soldier volunteered for watch. And the streets of Thessaloniki, so recently taken, belonged not to the conquerors, but to the bells. The bronze doors groaned as they were forced open, metal protesting after years of silence. The men hesitated, not from fear, not yet, but from the cold breath that spilled out into the sunlit street, as if the tower exhaled its own graveyard air. The captain barked a command, and the squad filed in. 5 men, armed, armored, disciplined. The church of Hagios Demetrios had long been abandoned, its icons stripped or defaced, its sanctuary turned to rot and dust. But the bell above had been ringing since dawn. No one could explain why. No one wanted to climb that staircase. But orders were orders. They disappeared before reaching the top. At first, there were no screams. Only silence. Then the bell stopped. Not faded, not faltered, stopped, as if a blade had cut through sound itself. An hour passed. Then 2. When no one emerged, another unit was sent. This time, they went slower. Step by step up the spiral, past flaking frescoes of saints whose eyes had been scratched out, past votive offerings still hanging like dried veins from the stone, past something that smelled, not of rot, but of copper and incense and time. They reached the final landing as the wind outside rose. The door to the belfry hung ajar. Inside, the light came in harsh from a shattered lancet window, cutting across the room like judgment. And then they saw it. Bones. Hundreds. Layered, organized, not thrown but placed, as if the dead had arranged themselves. Some were standing. Some kneeling. Some clasped in frozen prayer. Ribcages fused together with iron nails. Skulls split open to allow rusted chains to pass through eye sockets, linking them in vertical strands. Jawbones still hinged, gaping in silent devotion. Every rope of the bell mechanism was held, gripped by skeletal fingers, locked in death but tense, as though still bracing for the next toll. And at the center, one rope swayed. Not wildly. Not naturally. But with purpose. The air in the belfry was still. And yet the rope moved. Back and forth. Back and forth. The soldiers raised their weapons, some muttering prayers, others cursing under breath. One stepped forward. He reached for the rope. Then he saw the hand. It was not bone. Not desiccated. Not part of the ossuary that surrounded it. It was human. Pale. Smooth. Fingers calloused but clean. The nails intact. The wrist severed cleanly, but there was no blood, no sign of violence. The hand gripped the rope as tightly as any living man's. The flesh was warm. They stared, frozen, unsure whether to run or to finish what the others had started. Then the bell rang again. It should not have been possible. The mechanism had rusted into place. The wheels were locked. The ropes were frayed. And yet the sound rang clear, louder than before, echoing down the tower like thunder. The bones clattered. Some shifted. One skull fell from its perch and landed face up, staring blankly at the intruders. Its jaw opened slightly wider. Outside, others heard it. Civilians hiding in cellars. Ottoman officers crossing the plaza. Horses reared. Birds scattered. And in every church across the city, other bells answered. The soldiers in the tower never descended. Days later, the chamber was sealed. No one spoke of what had been found, not in official records, not in whispers. But the image remained, a hand without a body, still warm, clinging to a rope that no longer moved. Some say the bones in that tower were centuries old, the remains of monks who had locked themselves in when the city first fell to the Latins 200 years before. Others believed they had gathered there willingly, binding their own flesh with iron and prayer, forming a covenant with something darker than heaven. A bell that rings itself, a hand that refuses decay, and a silence that kills not with noise, but with memory. Thessaloniki had fallen. But not to the sword. Not entirely. Something had already claimed the churches. The Ottomans just inherited what the dead had left behind. Panic spread like fire on dry parchment, faster than any siege engine, swifter than any soldier. The gates of Thessaloniki had fallen, but something deeper had broken first, something inside the minds of the victors. They had trained for walls, for blades, for blood. Not for this. Not for the quiet. Not for the bells. Every street echoed with their tolling, yet no rope was seen to move. The tones were wrong, not triumphant, not mournful, but raw, stretched thin like sinew under tension. They sounded as if struck by unseen hands, deep within the stone, and each chime lingered like a wound that refused to close. Entire regiments refused their orders. Veteran janissaries, who had slit throats from Buda to Baghdad, stood paralyzed before the great doors of the basilicas. They said the stones watched. That if you stared too long into the mosaic eyes of Christ Pantocrator, they blinked, slowly, once, and did not look away. Others claimed the frescoes wept. Not symbolically. Literally. Oily streaks dripped down crumbling plaster walls, staining boots and puddling like ichor. A low mist clung to the altars and pulpit steps, too dense, too cold, too persistent. It did not lift in sunlight. It did not behave like weather. One imam, a young scholar from Bursa, entered the converted church of St. George to lead the first Friday prayer after the city's fall. He never finished the khutbah. Witnesses say he collapsed as the bells began, not outside, but within the walls, and when they lifted him, blood streamed from his ears. He was alive, but never spoke again. His mouth opened often, but only to exhale small, breathless moans, as though still hearing something the rest could not. The rumors turned into commands. Sacred sites were to be purged, neutralized, transformed. A battalion of janissaries was dispatched to the largest cathedral, the Hagia Sophia of Thessaloniki, with orders to destroy the bell tower entirely. No ceremony. No conversion. Just erasure. The soldiers approached with hammers, axes, and oil. They were met not with resistance, but a silence so complete it pressed against the eardrums like altitude. It was as though the sound had been removed, not muted, but stolen. Then the bells rang. Not from above, but beneath their feet. Deep tones, rising like breath through bone. Some dropped their weapons. Some ran. Others struck. When the first hammer hit stone, it didn't crack, it sank. The wall pulsed, recoiling slightly, then began to bleed. Not metaphorically. Blood seeped from the impact point, dark and thick, trailing down like melted wax from a black candle. It steamed in the cold air. One soldier touched it. His hand blistered instantly, skin sloughing off like wet bark. They tried again. More strikes. More bleeding. Then the whispers began. Faint at first, like wine through broken shutters. But growing. Louder. Words. Names. Numbers. But none of them in Turkish. Not Greek either. A Venetian translator was summoned, but he paled and shook his head. These were not the tongues of men. This was Latin, not the church Latin of popes and priests, but an older, rot-clotted dialect. It did not rise from the mouths of men. It came from the cracks. The sounds poured from the walls like breath from the dying. Some voices screamed. Others begged. A few chanted in loops, low, ritualistic. One repeated the same phrase again and again, non dimittam. Non dimittam. Non dimittam. I will not let go. By morning, the cathedral had been abandoned. Guards posted at its threshold drew lots to avoid duty. Those stationed there reported tremors underfoot at midnight, like a heartbeat pulsing through the stone. No officer enforced entry after that. The order was quietly changed. Sacred sites were now off-limits until further purification. No purification came. In the days that followed, bells rang at irregular intervals, not aligned with prayer, nor with clocks, but with deaths. Each time a soldier was found dead in his sleep, a bell had sounded the night before. Each time a child went missing, a rope was seen swinging from a tower window, though no wind stirred. Panic became protocol. The Ottomans had taken the city. But the city had kept something for itself. Something buried in mortar, bound in chain, and fed by silence. Whatever it was not done ringing. The command was absolute. The Grand Vizier, a man not given to superstition, issued it in a voice that brokered no dissent: silence the bells. They had echoed for weeks since the city's fall, relentless, maddening, and, worse, sourceless. No ropes. No ringers. Just sound, ancient and measured, rising from the ruins like breath from a dying body. And so the order was carried out with Ottoman precision. Iron chains were snapped with axes. Ropes soaked in oil and set aflame. Entire belfries brought down with gunpowder charges. The air above Thessaloniki turned black with dust and ash. But the bells did not stop. They rang from towers that no longer stood. They rang from churches burned to the foundations. They rang from beneath collapsed domes, buried in stone and time. At first, the soldiers assumed echoes. Then tricks of the wind. Then perhaps the bells had fallen into the catacombs and were sounding through hidden shafts. Tunnels were dug. Graves disturbed. Nothing. No metal. No mechanisms. Just bones, dust, and the unbroken toll, always at twilight. The vizier summoned the learned. Astronomers charted the stars. Philosophers measured the vibration in the air. Engineers tested the ruins for residual harmonics. Catholic priests, bribed and dragged from hiding, muttered frightened Latin and clutched their crosses until their knuckles turned white. A rabbi from Adrianople stood in the basilica and wept. One Jesuit claimed he deciphered a pattern in the bells, 13 notes repeated every evening, each matching the syllables of an ancient Greek lament for the dead. He was found drowned in the cistern 2 days later, his lungs full of salt water, though the sea was miles away. Then came the exorcists. Muslim, Christian, mystic. Incense was burned. Blood spilled. Psalms chanted in overlapping tongues. They tried to cast out what they could not name. And the bells kept ringing. Panic crept through the ranks like mildew through stone. The janissaries refused to guard the churches. The muezzins would not climb the minarets. Children were born deaf. Animals stopped breeding. In the markets, the fish rotted on the stalls, though the air was cold and dry. No one laughed. No one sang. And every dusk, the sound returned, slow, heavy, as if mourning something that refused to die. Word spread beyond the city. Some said Thessaloniki had never fallen, not truly, that its soul had resisted, and now cried out through brass and bone. Others whispered it was the doing of a sect, a forgotten brotherhood of monks who had made a pact before the siege, sealing their spirits into the towers to ring the last warning for eternity. One merchant, mad with fear, fled the city with his ears sewn shut and eyes burned out. He told the guards at Gallipoli, "The dead have remembered how to speak." It was then that the blind dervish arrived. He came without escort, wrapped in grey linen that hung loose on his frame like funeral cloth. His name was lost, if it was ever given. Some said he came from Konya. Others swore he had no homeland, that he walked between cities like a shadow, called only when silence failed. He entered the great mosque at dusk, just as the bells began their dreadful liturgy. And he climbed the ruined tower alone. Those who watched said the sound changed as he ascended. It grew clearer. Louder. As if the bells knew him. As if they welcomed him. He stood inside the shattered belfry for the length of 13 rings. Then nothing. Silence, for the first time in weeks. He came down bleeding from the ears. His face was pale. His feet bare. He walked the length of the prayer hall, knelt, and from the folds of his robe pulled a shard of glass. Without sound, he tore out his own tongue. Laid it on the stone floor like an offering. Then, with trembling fingers, he dipped it in ash and wrote a single line in charcoal, "They are still praying." He collapsed. And died before dawn. No one climbed a tower after that. Not the soldiers. Not the faithful. Not even the looters. The bells resumed the next night, louder than before, and now accompanied by something else, a low humming beneath the sound, like a choir with no mouths. Doors to churches were sealed with molten wax. The city moved its markets away from the old basilicas. New minarets were built far from the cursed foundations. But at dusk, always, the wind carried the sound. No longer just tolls, but supplication. It was not a city anymore. It was a cathedral of ghosts. And the bells, those impossible, defiant bells, had become its liturgy. The last tower fell in the spring of 1532. Not to gunpowder, not to hammers, but to silence. The Sultan's decree had been explicit: every Christian belfry still standing in Thessaloniki was to be pulled down, stone by stone, until no cross rose higher than the crescent. Crews worked day and night, watched by guards who refused to look upward. Even they had heard the bells, thin as breath, persistent as guilt, tolling from ruins where no metal remained. The final tower, that of the old Agia I Caterini, collapsed inward like a lung deflating. Dust rose, choked the sky, and for the first time in years, the city held its breath. For a week, the bells were silent. Then, on the 8th night, they began again. Not from towers, those were gone, but from the air itself. A single chime, soft and exact, drifting across rooftops like drifting ash. Then another. Then another. Always 12. Always at dusk. Always from different points in the city, never the same twice. The Ottomans forbade mention of it. Scholars were arrested. Monks disappeared. A caravan of Sufi mystics arrived, walked barefoot through the ruined churches, then vanished without word or trace. By then, the city had stopped asking questions. They built gardens where sanctuaries once stood. They paved over crypts. But nothing grew in those gardens, and the paving stones cracked in summer heat, as if rejecting the weight above them. Some nights, smoke coiled from the ground. In the governor's palace, Venetian maps were studied with increasing anxiety. A courier from Ragusa delivered a report sealed in human skin. It told of a merchant's wife who woke every night at the same hour to find herself standing before her window, head tilted to one side, listening. Not to noise, but to absence. She died on the eve of Easter, eyes wide, her mouth packed with communion wafers that no one had given her. 2 janissaries assigned to the church quarter were found with crushed windpipes, no bruises, no blood, just bones that had bent inward. Rumors spread that the bells were no longer just sound, but hunger. That something ancient was ringing not to be heard, but to be fed. They called it the tolling. And they counted. Each chime matched a death. Not a natural one. A specific kind, sudden, unexplainable, bone-breaking from within. Children were the first to vanish. Then the old. Then the clergy. Each time the bell rang, someone disappeared. No bodies. Only the smell of myrrh and scorched linen. When they dug into the foundations of the demolished towers, they found more than stone. Cavities filled with ash. Chains fused into walls. Skulls stacked like offerings, each with jaws frozen mid-scream. The bones were warm to the touch. One worker lost his hand after trying to lift a tibia marked with the symbol of Saint Basil. The limb blackened by morning. No one entered the ruins again. And yet, people still heard them. Especially during Lent, when the city dimmed itself in ritual shame. At midnight, in the upper quarters, footsteps could be heard on stairwells long crumbled. Bells rang without clappers, without wind, without metal. Just sound, raw, dry, unmerciful. The faithful stopped going to prayer after dusk. Muezzins refused to climb their minarets after sunset. And in the records of an Ottoman physician named Hakim Suleiman, a note survives: the sickness is not of the body, but of the land. It remembers the prayers of the dead. And it wants more. By the middle of summer 1533, even the animals had left. Birds avoided the rooftops. Dogs circled the churches, whining at shadows no one could see. Cats gathered in the market square at dusk, staring toward the hilltop ruins, then scattered with the first toll. Foreigners called it superstition. Locals called it truth. One name spread through the whispers: the Bell of Bones. Not a legend. A warning. It never stopped. Even now, some say if you hold your breath near the ruins, you'll hear the counting. 1, 2, 3. Always 12. Then silence. Then nothing. Until next dusk.